Reason most people never become millionaires isn't lack of money, intelligence, or opportunity, but because they're unknowingly playing the wrong financial game their entire lives. And the most surprising part is how early that mistake begins. Take an entire lifetime. You work for 40 years. You save carefully. You invest a little here and there. And eventually, maybe near retirement, you finally reach that number. $1 million. It always sounded like a distant milestone reserved for the far end of life, something slow, predictable, and almost ordinary. But then I started noticing something that didn't quite fit that story. Every so often, you hear about someone who reaches that same milestone in a fraction of the time. Not necessarily overnight, and not through some lucky lottery ticket, but through something they built, something they understood about money that most people seem to overlook. At first, I dismissed those stories. I assumed they were exceptions, rare cases, outliers that didn't apply to normal people. But the more I paid attention, the harder it became to ignore the pattern, because it kept showing up. Different industries, different backgrounds, different starting points. Yet somehow some people seemed to compress what should have taken 40 years into something much shorter. And that realization started to bother me in a strange way. Not out of jealousy, but out of curiosity. What were they seeing that the rest of us weren't? Were they simply smarter, luckier, or were they playing a completely different game? That question stuck in my mind for a long time. So I started reading more about personal finance, investing, entrepreneurship, the mechanics of wealth. Not because I had everything figured out, but because I genuinely wanted to understand how money actually works in the real world. And the deeper I looked, the more one surprising idea kept resurfacing. Most of us grow up learning only one path to wealth. But in reality, there are two. Two completely different approaches that lead to the same destination, yet operate on entirely different timelines. One of them is steady, patient, and almost invisible. It relies on discipline, time, and the quiet power of compounding. The other is far more dynamic, less predictable, sometimes uncomfortable, but potentially much faster. And once I started seeing these two paths clearly, the entire conversation about becoming wealthy began to look very different. Hey everyone, welcome to Wealth. On this channel, I'm not here to pretend I have all the answers. I'm simply someone deeply curious about how financial freedom is actually built, and I want to explore those ideas together with you. If you're interested in understanding money on a deeper level and thinking differently about how wealth is created, consider subscribing to the channel. Your support genuinely helps keep these conversations going. Because the truth is, once you start questioning the assumptions we've all grown up with about money, you begin to see something fascinating. Becoming a millionaire isn't just about working harder. It's about understanding which game you're actually playing. And most people don't even realize there are two. Once I started seeing that there might be more than one path to wealth, the first path became much clearer to me. And interestingly, it's probably the one most people have already heard about. When I first began learning about investing, one idea kept appearing everywhere I looked. Books about personal finance mentioned it. Experienced investors repeated it. Even economists often pointed to it as one of the most reliable long-term strategies. Invest consistently in the stock market, preferably through broad index funds, and give your money time to compound. At first, I remember feeling slightly underwhelmed by how simple it sounded. There was no dramatic strategy, no secret formula, no brilliant stock-picking genius required. The advice was almost boring in its simplicity. Put money into the market regularly, don't panic when prices move, and stay invested for a long time. But the more I thought about it, the more powerful the idea began to feel. Because compounding is one of those quiet forces that doesn't look impressive at the beginning. In the early years, progress feels slow, almost invisible. Your investments grow a little, then a little more, but nothing that feels life-changing. And then time starts doing something remarkable. Your money begins earning returns, and those returns begin earning returns of their own. What once grew slowly begins to accelerate. To put this into perspective, imagine someone investing about $470 every month into a broad market index fund, something similar to the S&P 500. Historically, if that investment averaged around 8% per year, it could eventually grow into $1 million. But there's an important detail attached to that number. It would likely take around 35 years. Now, if that monthly investment increased to $1,000, the timeline might shrink to about 26 years. Still long, but noticeably faster. When I first ran those numbers in my head, I felt two emotions at the same time. On one hand, it was reassuring. There was something comforting about knowing that becoming wealthy didn't require extraordinary brilliance. You didn't need to invent the next technology company or take huge financial risks. Discipline and patience alone could eventually get you there. But on the other hand, the timeline was impossible to ignore. 26 years, 35 years. That's an entire chapter of a person's life. Which is why this approach, despite being one of the most dependable ways to build wealth, also requires something that many people struggle with: patience on a massive scale. And that realization naturally leads to a deeper question. If long-term investing is the slow and steady road to wealth, is there any way to move faster without simply relying on luck? That question led me to examine one of the most common beliefs people have about money. A belief that feels logical at first, but slowly begins to fall apart the closer you look at it. Whenever someone decides they want to improve their financial life, the instinct is almost always the same. The first move is to start cutting expenses. Cancel the subscriptions you barely use. Cook at home more often. Choose the cheaper brand at the grocery store. Track every dollar so nothing slips through the cracks. I went through that phase myself, and honestly, at the time, it felt responsible. It felt like I was finally taking control of my finances instead of letting money disappear without thinking about it. But after a while, I started noticing something subtle. No matter how carefully I tried to optimize my spending, there was always a limit. There are only so many subscriptions you can cancel. Only so many dinners you can skip. Eventually, you reach a point where cutting further begins to affect your quality of life rather than your financial future. That realization made me think more carefully about a very simple formula that sits behind almost every financial discussion. Wealth equals income minus expenses. Most people focus almost entirely on the right side of that equation. We spend enormous amounts of energy trying to reduce expenses because it feels like something we control immediately. But what rarely gets the same level of attention is the other side of the equation: income. And when I started looking at the math more honestly, something surprising became clear. If someone earning an average salary manages to save around 20% of their income each year, that might translate to roughly $6,000 saved annually. On the surface, that sounds disciplined and impressive. Yet at that rate, reaching $1 million purely through saving would take well over a century. Even doubling that savings rate would still stretch the timeline across decades. That's when the insight really settled in for me. Saving money is important. It creates stability and breathing room in your life. But saving alone has a ceiling. Income, on the other hand, is a completely different story. In theory, it doesn't have the same upper limit. And once I started thinking about wealth from that perspective, the conversation shifted from how do I spend less to a much more interesting question. How do people actually increase their earning power in a meaningful way? That question pushed me to look more closely at where significant income growth actually comes from. For most people, the default path is employment. You build skills, gain experience, move up the ladder, and gradually increase your salary over time. There's nothing inherently wrong with that path. In fact, it's the foundation that supports the lives of millions of people. But when you step back and look at the structure of it, something becomes clear. A traditional job tends to grow in small, predictable steps. You might receive a raise of 5 or 10%. If things go well, you might earn a promotion that increases your income a bit more. Over the course of many years, those increases can add up. But the process itself usually moves slowly because your income is shaped by factors outside your direct control: company budgets, pay structures, performance reviews, and decisions made by people higher up in the organization. Even if you work twice as hard or deliver twice the value, the increase in pay rarely scales in the same way. This is where I began to notice that many people who reach significant wealth earlier in life are operating under a different set of rules. Instead of relying only on a salary, they create something that can grow beyond the limits of their personal time. Something that has the potential to expand, adapt, and serve more people without requiring the same number of hours from the person who started it. That's essentially the core idea behind entrepreneurship, but not necessarily in the way we often imagine it. When people hear the word business, they sometimes picture huge startups or massive companies. But in reality, scalable income can take many forms. It might be a service business supported by a small team, where the work is no longer dependent on just one person's schedule. It might be digital products, courses, templates, or resources that are created once and shared with many people over time. It could even be systems and processes that allow a small operation to handle far more clients than one individual ever could alone. Another powerful element is content itself. Platforms like YouTube, newsletters, or social media can gradually become long-term assets, attracting opportunities and audiences even while the creator focuses on other parts of their work. The more I studied these examples, the more one realization stood out. Wealth built quickly rarely comes from simply working more hours. It comes from building something that continues to create value beyond those hours. Once that idea started to sink in, another pattern became impossible to ignore. Many people begin building a business with the intention of creating freedom, but somewhere along the way, they accidentally recreate the same limitations they were trying to escape. Instead of a boss setting the boundaries of their time, the business itself becomes the new constraint. In the early stages, this makes sense. When something is new and fragile, the founder often handles everything: answering emails, delivering the service, managing customers, organizing payments, solving problems that appear out of nowhere. There's a certain pride that comes with doing it all yourself. It feels like dedication. But the longer I observed this pattern, the clearer the trap became. If every important task depends on one person, the system can only grow as much as that person's time and energy allow. No matter how passionate or hardworking someone is, there are still only 24 hours in a day. Eventually, the business stops expanding, not because the idea is bad, but because the structure can't support more growth. That's where a quiet but powerful shift begins to matter. The shift from working in the business to working on the business. It sounds subtle, but the mindset behind it is completely different. Instead of focusing on finishing every task personally, the focus moves toward designing processes that allow those tasks to happen without constant involvement. That might mean documenting how things are done so others can step in. It might involve outsourcing repetitive work to freelancers or small teams. Sometimes it's as simple as creating templates, systems, or automation that remove the need to reinvent the same solution again and again. Each small improvement increases the capacity of the system. And the more I think about this journey toward financial independence, the more it seems that wealth is rarely the result of one dramatic breakthrough. More often, it grows from a series of thoughtful changes in how time, energy, and resources are structured. At the same time, the slower path still has its place. Investing consistently in broad markets allows those earnings to compound quietly in the background. So perhaps the real strategy is not choosing between building and investing, but combining both. Create something that can grow beyond your time and allow disciplined investing to transform that growth into long-term financial stability. The more I reflect on it, the question that stays with me is no longer about saving a little more each month. It's about what kind of systems, ideas, or assets we can build that continue creating value long after the initial effort is finished. When you step back and look at everything we've explored, one idea becomes surprisingly clear. The journey toward wealth is not just about numbers, strategies, or financial tools. At its core, it's about understanding how time, effort, and opportunity interact with each other. For many of us, the way we were taught to think about money followed a simple script. Work hard, save diligently, avoid unnecessary spending, and eventually things will work out. And while there is truth in that advice, what often gets overlooked is that this approach was designed primarily for stability, not necessarily for building significant wealth within a shorter period of time. What begins to change the picture is the moment you realize there are different mechanisms that create financial growth. One mechanism is patience. This is where investing and compounding quietly do their work over decades. It may not feel exciting day to day, but over long periods, it can transform consistent contributions into meaningful wealth. This path rewards discipline and long term thinking. The other mechanism is expansion. This happens when someone focuses on increasing their earning capacity by building systems, skills, or assets that reach beyond their individual hours. Instead of trading time directly for money, they begin creating structures that allow value to multiply. Businesses, digital products, content platforms, and scalable services all operate on this principle. Neither path is inherently superior to the other. In fact, the most resilient financial strategies often combine both. You build something that grows your income, and at the same time, you allow that income to flow into long-term investments that compound steadily over time. One path creates momentum in the present, while the other protects and multiplies that progress in the background. The deeper lesson here may be less about becoming a millionaire and more about becoming intentional with how we design our lives around money. Instead of asking only how to earn or save more, we begin asking better questions. What skills are worth developing today that could expand our opportunities tomorrow? What systems could we build that continue creating value even when we step away? And how can we use the tools available to us, investing, technology, collaboration, to make our efforts more effective over time? These questions shift the focus from short-term gain to long-term architecture. They encourage us to think like builders rather than simply participants in the system. And maybe that's the most empowering realization of all. Wealth is not always about dramatic breakthroughs or rare opportunities. Often, it's about gradually aligning your decisions with structures that compound over time. Before we wrap up, I'd love to hear your perspective. Which path do you personally find more interesting right now? Focusing on building scalable income or focusing on long-term investing and compounding? Share your thoughts in the comments below so everyone watching can see different perspectives and learn from each other. And if you enjoy exploring ideas about money, financial independence, and building long-term wealth, consider subscribing to the channel. Your support truly helps the channel keep creating thoughtful content like this in the future.